wish everybody welcome to this October's Social Sciences Occasional Lecture. And I want to say a couple of things to faculty and students before I introduce our speaker. And for one thing, something that I realized that I have neglected in the past because I assumed that everybody knew, but I should probably also introduce myself. I'm Nina Rosenstand and I teach philosophy. So that being said, since our speaker has a past as captain of the U.S. Navy, I think it is appropriate to mention that this is a very good day for him to visit our campus because this is the Navy's birthday. Today is the 231st year of the Navy's birthday, predating our nation by 1 year. So since that's an important event, I wanted to mention that. And then that means that I can introduce our speaker, who is Michael Simpson. And have they ever called you Skipper?
Oh, yes.
Okay. All right. Retired captain of the U.S. Navy and former professor of Naval Science at NROTC unit at USD and SDSU and San Marcos and other campuses also. And a little bit about his background. He did his undergraduate work at the U.S. Naval Academy and his graduate work in National Security Affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, and he's done postgraduate studies at Harvard. And the title of his paper is The Law of War and Military Ethics. And the way we usually do it is the speaker speaks for however long he or she wants to speak, but no more than an hour, which is going to be accommodated today, I'm sure. And we reserve questions and answers for after the talk, unless there's a truly burning question, short question that needs to be addressed immediately. So let us follow that tradition today, and I want to welcome Captain Simpson. The Law of War and Military Ethics.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nina, and thank you for inviting me to do this. Thank you all for coming to participate in a discussion of military ethics. I think it is truly an important subject. Certainly, I'm sure you all read the newspapers and you know how much of an issue military ethics and some of the associated issues are right now. I don't think I need to do any more introduction of myself. Professor Rosenstand has done a great job of saying who I am. Let me make a couple of disclaimers or clarifications, though, before I get into my talk. If you're expecting to hear the official Navy position on anything, that's not what you're going to hear. I am retired, have been retired for 3 years, and I am speaking only for myself, not for the Navy, not for the NROTC unit, not for any component of the government. You're just hearing a private citizen's view on these issues, so that's important. The clarification, if you happen to look at the flyer, it gives my current affiliation. It says the Ranger Group. Some of you may have thought, gee, is this guy an Army Ranger or somehow associated with the Army Rangers? No. The Ranger Group is actually a consulting company here in San Diego, and the owner, founder, president is a real enthusiast about Western American history, and the title or the name of the company, the Ranger Group, actually refers to the founding and the history of the Texas Rangers. It has nothing to do with Army Rangers. So in case you were confused about that, please don't be. Having had a long Navy career, there's a form that I'm very used to dealing with. It's how we report an investigation of any kind. It could be a very simple, informal investigation, or it could be a very formal investigation. But it's broken down into 3 categories: facts, opinions, and recommendations. And what I'm going to be giving you, and I promise it's not going to last any more than an hour, probably not an hour, is I'm going to use that format because first I'm going to talk about some things that I would call facts that pretty much anybody in a discussion about military ethics and current issues would agree to. Then we'll clearly say, now I'm giving you some opinions, and they are my personal opinions, and then I will end the talk with some recommendations. But if you wonder, where does that come from? It's how the military does investigative reporting. So let me start out with the fact portion. Military ethics really is the union of 2 separate fields, or the intersection of those fields. We draw a lot from philosophy and we draw a lot from law. So to begin and sketch some background for this talk, I wanted to go through a little bit of that history of military ethics and where we draw some. I think it's important to understand that historical background. Any history professors here? I'm hoping for some help from, oh good. If I misquote history, you're welcome to correct me or make additional comments during our discussion period, please. From philosophy, clearly ethics is a branch of philosophy, military ethics is a branch of ethics writ large. From philosophy, we draw primarily on just war theory. Just war theory, as many of you probably know from your studies, has a long history, and it really consists of two primary components. There is jus ad bello, or the justice of war, and there's jus in bello, or justice in war, just conduct in war. I'm not going to say too much about jus ad bello in this talk because it's not directly related to military ethics, but basically that's a field of just war theory that deals with just causes for going to war. That is really more for policymakers and for our president and national leaders to decide when just cause exists for going to war. That's not something the individual soldier, sailor, marine, airman needs to think too much about in terms of military ethics. The second branch of just war theory, however, is at the very heart of military ethics. That's jus in bello, just conduct in war, and that's one of the strains from history that we devised or codes of ethical conduct for military personnel. Just war theory has a long history, as many of you probably know. St. Augustine, in his writings in the 4th century, is considered the father of just war theory. He wrote quite a bit about both jus ad bello and jus in bello, and was really the main source for many centuries. Then in the 13th century, St. Thomas Aquinas, writing in Summa Theologica, kind of tried to bring it up to date. A lot happened between the 4th century and the height of the Middle Ages, and so Aquinas, in his writings, developed a lot more specific details about just war theory. It was further developed by a number of other writers during the Middle Ages. I'm going to now skip over a lot of centuries and tell you that the best thing to read if you want to get a really good grounding is Michael Walzer's well-known book, Just and Unjust Wars. That came out in 1977. Walzer is a professor at Yale, I believe, still. And he still does a lot of writing about just war theory. So that's one strain that we draw from in trying to think about what military ethics and just conduct in war should be. The second strain is law. And often when people talk about the law of war, the first quote that comes to mind is a well-known quote from Cicero, and I'm going to try it in Latin, but I'll tell you I'm not a classicist. Cicero wrote in the 1st century, Silent enim leges inter arma. The law is silent during war. Maybe in 1st century Rome, he wrote this in the midst of a civil war over who would control the Roman Empire. Maybe in his time and place that was true, but it has not been true either before or after the time of Cicero. When you look at the history of international war, people have been trying to humanize the worst aspects of war for a long time. Sun Tzu, the Chinese warrior scholar that all military officers study as a source on strategy, in the 6th century BCE, Sun Tzu wrote about what is just and what is unjust for soldiers to do in war. In the 2nd century BCE, the Hindu code of Mamu also attempted to put some rules into place about just conduct in war. The Quran, for example, a religious source, as well as the Christian Bible, talks about proper behavior in war. So there is a long history, even before Cicero said the war is silent. People have, throughout history, attempted to put into place a set of rules for soldiers to follow, for all participants in war to follow, that would minimize the horrible effects of war. Jumping ahead in history quite a bit, one of the key events in our own Western tradition of military ethics was the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648. A terribly destructive war, killed roughly 1/3 the population of what's now modern Western Europe, wiped out about 40% of the wealth in much of Europe, and it was just horrible in terms of its effect on civilians. Whole towns were burned, populations were slaughtered. An individual who is kind of considered the father of international law, Hugo Grotius, was alive during almost all of that war. He died about 3 years prior to the peace being signed. But in 1625, Grotius published a tract called On the Law of War and Peace. And he was specifically impacted by the events that he had observed in the 30 Years' War. A quote that I think kind of sums up his beliefs. Quote, "I saw in the whole of the Christian world a license of fighting at which even barbarous nations might blush. Wars were begun on trifling pretexts, or none at all, and carried out without any reference to law, divine or human. And Grotius took it upon himself, along with some other scholars, I could give some other names, but Grotius and others took it on themselves to again try to put down some rules of what should be and should not be allowed during the course of war." The war was ended by the Treaty of Westphalia, as many of you know, and we tend to think of Westphalia in certain ways in the modern world. First of all, we think of it as the foundation of the nation-state system, which it pretty much was. We think of it as the separation of religious and political power, because the 30 Years' War was so terrible and bloody because it was partly religious and partly political. And when people fight on the basis of religious ideology, you know, God is on our side feeling, they tend to do terrible things. And so the treaty tried to separate political and religious power. And finally, the Treaty of Westphalia really put into place the concept of an individual nation-state sovereignty. And you can follow that thread right into the current United Nations Charter. But it did something else that I think a lot of people either have forgotten or maybe overlooked in long history since Westphalia. It was the first time the, quote, international community, although it wasn't called that back then, it was called the Great Powers. But it was the first time the international community had the reaction of never again. And that is repeated in history. It was certainly repeated after the Second World War and the Holocaust. It's been brought up in a number of cases of genocide. But the Treaty of Westphalia was really the first time in modern history that the international community said, never again, this is too horrible to allow this kind of thing to happen. And so the Treaty of Westphalia kind of was the beginning of what I would call the modern strain of international law of war. It attempted to civilize war. That process sort of stayed fairly static for a couple of centuries. But in the middle of the 19th century, following some other wars in which people saw horrible things, the Crimean War, the American Civil War, particularly with respect to the way wounded were treated or not treated or mistreated on the battlefield, and some of the things that were done to non-combatants, the international community, or at least elements of the international community, felt that we needed to revisit this idea of creating some law that would ameliorate the worst aspects of war. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time here talking about those developments and how they play to our current status on the law of war. The first international conference in Geneva was held in 1863. After the Crimean War, toward the latter part of our Civil War, interestingly, it was inspired by Henri Durant, the founder of the International Red Cross. And there is still a very close tie between Geneva Conventions and the International Red Cross and the role of the Red Cross in the law of war. But anyway, this conference met in 1863, and the following year, in 1864, was published the first Geneva Convention. And it really was fairly limited. It didn't deal with all of the issues that are current in modern Geneva Conventions and military ethics. But it was the beginning. In 1899, the first International Peace Conference was held in The Hague, again, to try to look at creating a set of rules for land warfare. That conference published the Convention with respect to law and customs of war on land. In rapid succession then, in 1906, there was a follow-on convention in Geneva to update the first one that had been published in 1864, and that is in fact the Geneva Convention that was in effect during the First World War. In 1907, literally almost on the heels of that, there was a second peace conference in The Hague to again try to update and modernize for emerging technologies in the early 20th century, the convention with respect to law and customs of war on land. World War I happens in 1914 to 1918. Lots of terrible things happen. Again, much of the international community says, this was terrible, we shouldn't let these things happen, even in the middle of war. And so in 1929, the next Geneva Convention is held to update previous convention, and it was in this convention, the one published or agreed upon in 1929, that there was the first separate protocol that dealt with prisoners of war. And that becomes important later. It was this convention, the 1929 conventions, that were enforced during World War II. Interestingly, Germany was a party to the convention. Japan was not. I'm going to come back to that point later in the talk. After World War II, obviously lots of terrible things happened, both on the battlefield and to non-combatants. And again, the international community says our laws weren't good enough. We weren't covered in all respects. So in 1949, there was a complete revision of the pre-existing Geneva Conventions, and those 4 separate conventions with some additional protocols are in fact the basis of current international law respecting warfare and the thread from which we draw most of our teachings for today's military personnel on military ethics. The development did not stop in 1949. Additional work has been done over the years since then. In 1977, 2 additional protocols were added and agreed upon by almost all the nations of the world that extended the body of international law comprising the Geneva Conventions to civil wars. Before that point, everything in Geneva dealt with interstate wars, and civil wars were simply kind of a black hole. And it was in 1977 that black hole was filled in with law. Development has certainly continued in the past decade and a half with numerous war crimes tribunals, such as for former Yugoslavia, for Rwanda, for Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, such as was done in South Africa, and recently with the establishment of the International Criminal Court. So this development of law is not a static thing that you just say, okay, it happened here and that was it. It continues, and when we train our military people, particularly our officers, in military ethics, this law, along with previously mentioned philosophic underpinning of just war theory, is the basis of what we teach for military ethics. For most of the history that I've just talked about, certainly from the first Geneva Conventions in the mid-19th century to very recent history, the United States has been and has been seen as one of the real leaders in championing the rule of law as opposed to the rule of strength or other things. Most of the rest of the world, especially in post-World War II history, has looked to the United States to be a leader in the development of attempting to continue to strengthen and apply law to war and warlike situations. Sadly, that situation has changed in the last few years. Not only are we not seen as a leader right now, we're seen more or less as an obstructionist, and as you know from current news issues, It's the situation in Guantanamo, the application of this sort of strange term of unlawful enemy combatant to the detainees there. So a lot of people feel like the United States has stepped back from its role of championing law and in fact are rolling back some of the gains of the last 60 years since the 1949 conventions. And that's another point that I want to come back to shortly. Okay, let me talk a little bit now about what did the Geneva Conventions say. I know some of you are probably familiar with this. I'm not going to take enough time to make you all an expert, but I think it's useful just to hear some of the words in the summary of the Geneva Conventions. My source for this particular summary, and I think it's a particularly good one, is the International Committee of the Red Cross. It's a small pamphlet that is handed out to military forces literally throughout the world, and it's titled The Basic Rules of the Geneva Conventions and Their Additional Protocols. It's a very factual summary. There's no editorializing or no opinion or recommendations like I'm going to get into shortly. Just what do the Geneva Conventions say? So bear with me for a minute. I'm going to read you 7 short statements that summarize pretty much the key provisions of the currently existing Geneva Conventions. Number 1, persons hors de combat, in other words, out of combat. That could include a wounded person, a person who is attempting to surrender, a non-combatant, which is a civilian that happens to be caught on the battlefield. Persons hors de combat and those who do not take a direct part in hostilities are entitled to respect for their lives and their moral and physical integrity. They shall in all circumstances be protected and protected humanely without any adverse distinction. Number 2, it is forbidden to kill or injure an enemy who surrenders or who is hors de combat. Number 3, the wounded and sick shall be collected and cared for by the party to the conflict which has them in its power. Protection also covers medical personnel, establishments, transports, and equipment. The emblem of the Red Cross or the Red Crescent is the sign of such protection and must be respected. Number 4, captured combatants and civilians under the authority of an adverse party are entitled to respect for their lives, dignity, personal rights, and convictions. They shall be protected against all acts of violence and reprisals. They shall have the right to correspond with their families and to receive relief. That element is very much essential to this argument going on right now within the administration and Congress regarding Common Article 3. It has to do with the treatment of captured combatants and civilians. Number 5, everyone shall be entitled to benefit from fundamental judicial guarantees. No one shall be held responsible for an act he has not committed. No one shall be subjected to physical or mental torture, corporal punishment, or cruel or degrading treatment. Number 6, parties to a conflict and members of their armed forces do not have an unlimited choice of methods and means of warfare. It is prohibited to employ weapons or methods of warfare of a nature to cause unnecessary losses or excessive suffering. Of interest on that element, that goes very directly back to just war theory and a component of that theory called proportionality. It means you cannot use disproportionate force or methods to achieve your aims in the war. It's not good to wipe out an entire city and kill lots of civilians because you want to attack a small military unit that might be located there. That's proportionality, and that's what this element is getting at. Number 7, parties to a conflict shall at all times distinguish between the civilian population and combatants in order to spare civilian population and property. Neither the civilian population as such nor civilian persons shall be the object of attack. Attacks shall be directed solely against military objectives. And that element is, the heart of that is obviously in war, you do not want to threaten or injure or kill non-combatants, but only those people engaged in combat. So that, in essence, is what the Geneva Conventions are about. Those are the fundamental principles that are at the root of what we teach in military ethics. What I just covered, and I suspect it took me about 3 minutes to read that summary, that actually is about a week's worth of classes and readings and essays that almost all future military officers are provided. I certainly can't speak for all services, so I'm just going to speak for how the Navy and Marine Corps do this. We teach military ethics specifically to our future officers just prior to when they're commissioned and are responsible and may be on a battlefield. And those are the foundations that we cover. And with some relevant case studies from World War II, from Vietnam, and other more recent conflicts. Let me also make a couple of points. I mean, these are kind of sidebars from the main point of this talk, but since I do have the background as a professor of naval science, many of you probably wonder, gosh, what are we teaching our officers? I thought I'd take a few minutes to talk a little bit about some of that. So the first point is how do we, the military services, view Geneva Conventions and other kinds of treaties? It's pretty straightforward and pretty simple. When the United States ratifies a treaty, it becomes federal law. Our oath, which is to support and defend the Constitution, actually is not just the Constitution, it's the whole constitutional framework, and that includes all federal laws. So when we take our oath of office and say we'll support and defend the Constitution, we're also swearing to support and defend such things as the Geneva Conventions, which, because of treaty law, are in fact part of our federal code of laws. So, and we tell people that straightforward. You know, you can't break a law, and this is a law. And if you break this law through misconduct in war and during combat, you'll be punished for that. So that's a fairly straightforward and clear point. We take a lot of time to try to make that point. Okay, second sidebar is, as I said, I want to give you a sense of how we teach military ethics to our military officers. So I brought along one of the basic textbooks. This is called Ethics for Military Leaders. It's used in all of our NROTC units. It's used at the Naval Academy because Marine officers come from those same sources. Naval officers, Marine officers get basically this. I know for a fact the Army at West Point uses a very similar text. I'm not so sure what the Air Force is using right now at Colorado Springs, but similar, because all the academies have to meet certain federally mandated requirements. But let me just, without going into a lot of detail, let me just kind of read through the table of contents of this text, which in turn is the essential syllabus for a one-semester course in Ethics for Military Leaders. It starts out with introduction to the concept of moral reasoning, and we go back to the classics, to Plato and other philosophers, and try to establish the concept of moral reasoning as one of the responsibilities that a military officer has. Then constitutional ethics and moral obligations of military service, and in that module, we stress your loyalty is not to an individual. Your loyalty at the highest level is to the Constitution. And there's actually a hierarchy that we teach people, but it starts with the loyalty to the Constitution. Then utilitarianism, then Kantian ethics, truth-telling, liberty as the foundation of moral right, justice, virtue, that's Aristotelian ethics, by the way, natural law, divine command, quite a bit on just war theory, and then the kind of end of the class, the payoff in this is called conduct of war, and it is a combination of just war theory, the jus in bello part of just war, and the Geneva Conventions. And then it wraps up with a section called the moral leader, in which we talk about military heroes who have done the right thing, the morally and ethically right thing, at great cost to themselves. So that's what people come into the military as a new officer having been exposed to. What I've covered so far is pretty much the facts in this investigative report, and I think most people would not have too much disagreement with anything I've said to this point. The next portion, not necessarily so. This is opinion. A lot of people would probably disagree with some of what I'm going to say, although not all of it, I hope. And the general heading for my opinion section is, why does all this stuff matter to the United States and to our national interest? Why is it important that our image with respect to supporting Geneva Conventions and international law and other treaty obligations? The first and probably the most obvious issue is what I call the reciprocity argument. If we treat your soldiers bad and you capture one of mine, what are we going to say when you treat our soldiers bad? It is a very pragmatic, practical argument about protection of our own soldiers in the event that they are captured. Certainly the students and probably most of the faculty is a little young to remember a lot about the Vietnam era, but for those of you that do, you can probably try to recall some of the things that were said and written about North Vietnam and the way they treated prisoners of war, captured American soldiers and aviators in that war. And if you just go back and reread some of that stuff, change a couple of names and words, and you think, gee, I might be reading something about the abuse scandal at Abu Ghraib or some of the allegations that have been made against Guantanamo. So the main selling point for many nations, including the United States, for much of the history of the Geneva Conventions, has been this very practical argument of, okay, I'll treat your captured soldiers well, so you promise to treat my captured soldiers well. A second, also practical, pragmatic argument for supporting the Geneva Conventions is a little more subtle, but it's one that is taught to our military services. And that is, if soldiers know that a country is committed to humane legal treatment, they are more inclined to surrender. As opposed to fight to the death. I said I would come back to that issue about Germany and Japan, one being a party of the 1929 convention, the other not. One of the things, if you go back and look at World War II, German soldiers were much more inclined, when things were obviously hopeless, to surrender because they truly believed that they would not be killed or tortured, they would be taken care of, whereas the Japanese did not. Now, part of that is probably cultural, and the cultural anthropologists might explain it from that point of view. I think you can make the argument that because the Japanese didn't have this sort of in the back of their mind that, okay, if I surrender, I'm going to be treated okay, they believed that the Americans were barbarians and would do terrible things, and there was no incentive to surrender. And so much more than with the German forces, the Japanese tended to just fight to the death because they didn't think there was much of an alternative. There was an op-ed piece in the New York Times a few weeks ago now. This came out September 25th by a former Army officer, a guy named Paul Reichhoff. And he summarized this argument pretty well. I said, and I'm quoting now from this op-ed piece, when an enemy fighter knows he'll be treated well by the United States forces if he is captured, he is more likely to give up. And that was after, he wrote this, by the way, after serving in Iraq. He was talking specifically about Iraqi insurgents when he wrote that. And there have been a number of essays, op-ed pieces, editorials that you can read over the last couple of years that make that point. I absolutely am not minimizing the importance of those two pragmatic arguments that support strict adherence to the Geneva Convention. But my view is that there's a much more mushy, but also more important argument to be made as to why we should follow the rules, both the just war theory rules, the international law rules about just conduct in war. It is about maintaining the moral high ground. That is a difficult argument sometimes to make, particularly if you're fighting a non-state actor like Al-Qaeda a group that doesn't appear to be following the same rules or even care if there are any rules. But I think in spite of all those difficulties, and I don't want to make light of the difficulties, this moral high ground argument is a really important reason why we, the United States, should try to regain that position we had for many, many years as the champion of international law, the champion of ethical conduct in war. And it gets to the fundamental question of what kind of nation America is. Who are we as a people? We have always stood for certain things. One of those things that we've stood for is the rule of law as opposed to the rule of brute strength. We follow rules because they're the rules, because it's the right thing to do. Interestingly, a senior Army officer, Major General David Petraeus, when he came back from Iraq, he had commanded a division, I think the 101st Airborne Division, in Iraq during some of the really difficult insurgency fighting. In talking to a group of Army ROTC cadets who were just short of being commissioned, he told them, sort of, hey, I've been there. I will tell you that sometimes there are 1,000 reasons to break the rules. There's one reason to follow the rules, and that's because they're the rules. And if we don't follow them, we wind up in chaos. And I think General Petraeus made a good point to these future officers. Sometimes there are lots of good reasons to not obey the rules of law or the rules of war. You can persuade yourself through logic, through immediate exigencies, that it's okay to conduct a battlefield execution, or this person, gee, I'm not sure if it's a combatant or a non-combatant, okay, it's easier just to shoot the person and be done with it. His point is you have to follow the rules because they are the rules. And I don't want to minimize the difficulty of that. And in a symposium earlier this week, we were talking a great deal about how do you apply this kind of thinking when you're on the battlefield, people are dying around you, it's not clear at all who's the good guy and who's the bad guy and who's sort of a neutral. It's very difficult, but I think we owe it to our soldiers to try to give them the best grounding that we can in the rationales, why it is in our interest and their interest as soldiers in the long run to follow these rules. Let me quote again briefly from that same op-ed piece I mentioned earlier on this issue of moral strength. Rykoff writes, America's moral integrity was the single most important weapon my platoon had on the streets of Iraq. And then I'll finish the quote with sort of a sad comment. But those days are over. America's moral standing has eroded thanks to its flawed rationale for war and scandals like Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, and Haditha. A similar thought was expressed by a guy who saw this from a much higher perspective, a retired Marine Corps general named Anthony Zinni. Some of you probably know who Tony Zinni is. He's written and spoken quite a bit. In a recent conference at Johns Hopkins, General Zinni gave the keynote address. And I'm going to not read this entire quotation, but the cogent parts of it. I heard one of the senior correspondents who works for the New York Times and has been in Iraq almost since the beginning of the conflict. He was recapping the war as we approached this third anniversary of the conflict. He said that in his mind, the most significant event that occurred in Iraq was the Abu Ghraib scandal. He referred to it as an arrow in the back of every soldier and Marine that was operating on the ground. An arrow in the back. So an observer to this conflict for 3 years felt that the worst thing that had happened was something that degraded our moral credibility and the moral credibility of those troops on the ground who are trying to win hearts and minds. So there's kind of the same thought from somebody who saw things from the top end. General Zinni, if you don't know, was prior to his retirement, prior to the current Iraq war, the commander of Central Command, the military command that's responsible for that part of the world and responsible for prosecuting this war. So Zinni had thought a lot about the possibility of war in Iraq and has thought a lot about insurgencies and counterinsurgencies. And his point there is similar to this op-ed piece, is the worst thing that has happened to those troops on the ground is the loss of moral credibility that has come about because of things like the abuse of prisoners at Abu Ghraib. And if you follow the press, particularly during the period and now just after the period when the whole discussion between Senate Republicans and the administration has gone on about Common Article 3 and what should be the U.S. position with respect to Geneva and detainees, you read a lot. Yesterday's New York Times, in fact, had an editorial criticizing the administration for squandering so much of our moral authority, and make the point, efforts, and I'm quoting here, efforts to shame or to bully the right behavior from adversaries or allies, another important aspect, sound hollow. And I think that's where I really come down in this moral high ground argument, is if we lose that moral credibility, it's very difficult for us then to go criticize President Putin in Russia for things happening in Chechnya, go to lots of countries around the world where abuses are occurring. Unless you have some moral credibility, it's very hard to say much about that. And that, I think, is why truly it's in our interest to kind of get back on the right path with respect to international law and military ethics. The line that has been kind of followed in these last at least couple of years, if not 3 years, is this is a new kind of war, it's a new kind of adversary, and therefore the old rules don't seem to fit anymore. I think that there's a long-term adverse consequence to following that rule, because it's a, you could call it a slippery slope argument, I guess. It opens the door for all kinds of people to say, hey, this is a different kind of war, it's a different kind of adversary, and so we're going to change the rules. Something that hit me with the shock just the other day. Charles Taylor, the former dictator in Liberia, before he was deposed and is now hauled in front of an international war crimes tribunal, he also used the term unlawful combatants to describe his foes in Liberia. He didn't make it up. He borrowed it from the American view of those people that were holding in Guantanamo. And now I'm going to ask the history professor to maybe join in the discussion in a bit. One of the things that I've looked at in terms of our current policies, and are they legal, are they moral, are they in fact in America's best interest, is some historical similar kinds of things. And if you study American history, you probably almost everybody learns that John Adams, was wildly unpopular and only had one term because of the Alien and Sedition Act, what history judged to be an illegal curtailment of individual freedom. Abraham Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus during the American Civil War, ultimately approved by Congress, but at the time he did it, clearly an illegal act by a president. World War I, another sedition act that was utilized to imprison a number of people who were opposed to America's participation in World War I. World War II, the internment of Japanese Americans, strategic bombing of cities by both America and Great Britain. I could give other examples, but I bring this sort of historical perspective into this talk because in every case, with hindsight, history has judged those kinds of acts, those kinds of government policies to be mistaken. Some more gently, some less gently, but history is a pretty good judge, I think, of who does right, who does wrong. And I think that when we are able to step back and look at the Iraq War, the current Iraq War, with a little bit of historical hindsight, my own opinion is history is going to be fairly harsh in saying the government's policies were wrong, both legally and ethically. America has led the world for a lot of decades mostly by being true to our values. And I think it's very important that we stay true to our values, and some of those values are, in fact, embedded in what we teach to our young officers as military ethics. Okay, those were opinions. You can sort of take them or leave them. Let me end this, and I'm almost at the end, with some recommendations. The first category of recommendations, I would say these are recommendations to the leadership of the country, and I'll say up front, no, they're not going to follow them because I or a few other people give these recommendations, but I think it's important that these things be said publicly, that they become part of the public debate, and to a large degree I think they have just in the last 3 to 6 months. But if I were king for a day, what would I want the country to do? First, I think very clear, strong statement that we do in fact adhere to the Geneva Conventions, and that we will immediately change any conduct that appears to be contrary to those conventions. I think in terms of public diplomacy, that needs to be done, and it needs to be done very soon. The second thing that needs to be done, and again, I think it needs to be done very promptly, is we need to develop a legally acceptable and viewed as legally responsible process for dealing with the people that we have captured in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and other places. There needs to be some kind of judicial process. You can't just throw somebody in jail and say, that's it, they'll stay there forever. That isn't what we're about. So we need to establish and implement that process. And when that is done, and once that's done, I think we need to close Guantanamo as quickly as we can. I think the British foreign minister, who described it as something like a blot on our image, is exactly right. Guantanamo has become such a flashpoint for criticism of almost any other U.S. policies that there's nothing to do with it except close that detention center. So, do I think the administration is going to do any of those things? No, not right away. I think public pressure of the sort that you read in the newspapers, that you're hearing from some members of Congress, will certainly push the administration to do some of those things. So my final set of recommendations is, okay, what can we all do, and people like us, what can we do to help get the nation back toward that better path? And there are a few things I think that we can all do. One is that we can speak out. We can go to various kinds of gatherings and conferences, particularly academics or members of faculties often have the opportunity to talk about these things in current events, and so we speak out. One of the ways that I have sort of come to think of as important is particularly speak out to international audiences. And if that's one friend from another country, or if it's a large group of people that you have a chance to talk to, tell people that it isn't necessarily that all Americans believe that it's okay to abuse prisoners. In fact, right now the polls would indicate that something like 60+% of Americans kind of think McCain and Graham and Warner had it right in their position with respect to Geneva Convention. The three senators, for those that haven't followed that story, 3 Republican senators that attempted to get the administration to move closer to support for the Geneva Conventions. For those of us that have friends in positions of authority, I think it's important that we tell them how we feel. Write a letter to your congressman, your senator, your friend that might be an admiral or a general or president of a university or whatever, but where we have influence with opinion papers and policymakers, I think it's important that we try to influence them. And for students, you think, gee, I don't know anybody important. Sure you do. You know your parents, you know lots of people that may be opinion shapers. And if you feel strongly about these things, you have to say so. And then finally, we got an election coming up on November 7th. Traditionally, our turnout for elections is lousy, particularly for midterm elections. You know how the rest of the world sees that? And I've spent a lot of time, particularly in Europe, but also in parts of Asia lately. They say, okay, if the Americans aren't concerned enough to even go vote, then they must support the existing policies. And that's a pretty straight linkage. When they see less than 50% of eligible voters going to vote, they think, okay, the majority of Americans are happy with the way things are going. So whatever your political affiliation, whatever you think about, this issue of military ethics, just go vote. And if more people vote and say things are fine and let's just continue, well, at least we voted and we've spoken. My guess is that if everybody who cares votes, there will be some changes. Okay, let me just say this is a good point to stop, I think. I've given some facts as background from the fields of philosophy and law that give us our military ethics. I've offered some opinions. I've tried to identify anything I said that was opinion, not fact. And I've just given some recommendations. So thank you for your attention. You're a really polite audience, I have to say. I'm used to, in some circles, people like, hiss and boo at some of that stuff. But thanks for your attention. And now we've got still an hour of room time left. And so discussion, please, because your opinions are certainly as important as what I've just said. So the lady in the back had the first comment, and then I'll get to the two gentlemen over here. Yes, ma'am.
Relevant to the high moral position that you teach and also support, then looking at the administration's distrust in the Geneva Convention Treaty, and also the distrust in international law in general, what is your analysis or opinion of the Military Commissions Act of 2006 that has gone through both houses?
I guess let me give the short answer. I think that the initial position taken by the three renegade senators was right. I think they compromised far too much with the administration to get something through.
Yes.
I'm not going to try to talk to the motives for why that might have happened, why they gave up so much of their initial position, but I think I would have been much happier if that act looked a whole lot more like what Senators McCain, Warner, and Graham first said should be the position.
Yes.
I feel like it didn't do very much to get us back on the path. I think the debate itself has been helpful. More people are thinking about it, talking about it, writing about it, and maybe it's a start. It's certainly not a good end, but maybe it's not a bad start. Ma'am, we'll get to you. There are two gentlemen over here. We start with, on the very end.
Gee, you mean rendition is not our national CYA?
Well, it shouldn't be, I would say. In fact, I didn't talk specifically about this extraordinary rendition policy. Does everybody know what that is, or should I define it?
Define it.
Please define it.
Okay, rendition is a policy that was adopted after the attacks of September 11, 2001, that basically says if we identify a terrorist, an Al-Qaeda specifically type of person, anywhere in the world, we can just go in and snatch that person, kidnap him extrajudicially, not do a sort of normal kind of arrest in consonant with that country's laws. And we have in fact done that. We have gone in and snatched some terrorists. And admittedly, I mean, I don't want to just throw rocks at the administration. Some of these have been real bad guys that needed to be off the street. But the way we did it was pretty clearly illegal in terms of both international law and the law of the countries involved. And then after we snatched the terrorists, they were flown off to various, in some cases, secret prisons, or at least unacknowledged prisons. They were flown and turned over to countries in which torture is much more common than it is with the United States. So that has been a real flashpoint, particularly with our European allies, because European Union law is pretty strict in terms of protecting individual rights, and clearly a number of European governments that either cooperated or at least acquiesced in this policy of extraordinary rendition have come in for their own share of criticism. But no, I would say that is part and parcel of this whole approach to this war that has put us in a very difficult situation in terms of occupying the moral high ground. Yes, sir, you had the next question.
Yes, I'd like to go back to a statement you made concerning World War II. You seem to say the reason the Japanese didn't surrender because they thought their prisoners would not be treated well by the Americans. And you've totally downplayed the whole samurai code, the Bushido code, the concept of losing face. As an individual who spent time in Asia, you know the importance of that. In my opinion, that was a much greater reason for them not surrendering. The prisoner who surrendered was considered less than human. That's why they treated the Americans so bad. But yet you seem to put more emphasis on the fact that the Japanese did not sign the Geneva Convention and thought their prisoners wouldn't be treated fairly. I'd like you to expand upon that.
If I overemphasize the one and underemphasize the other, it wasn't intentional. I didn't mention cultural anthropological factors,
Yeah, but
that's what I was
just
talking about. Clearly, yeah, that was an important component. How much their samurai code influenced refusal of people to surrender and the decision to fight to the death no matter what, I'm not a good expert on that to judge. Your point's well taken. It was cultural. It was also, I think, there was this issue of truly they believed that Americans might eat them, torture them, do all kinds of horrible things because that's what they believed. You had the next question.
I just wondered if you would briefly, I know you've touched on it, but I'm not clear in my mind, and I've been following the story, exactly how the law that passed that allows us to treat enemy combatants or unlawful combatants outside of Geneva Conventions. So what does that allow? How does it specifically veer away from the Geneva Conventions?
That's a really good question, and I'm hesitating because I don't really have all the facts right at my fingertips about what are the law. If other people maybe are more knowledgeable about how that law finally came out. I know that there are a couple of issues about the law. One is sort of retroactively protecting people who may have engaged in torture, I think since 1997 or something like that.
So we're going to say you pass.
Yeah, kind of, and it's mostly for protecting CIA personnel, not military personnel. So that's one issue that I think is very questionable from a legal point of view. The second thing has to do with what is euphemistically called rough tactics and interrogation. Many people just label it as torture. Things like waterboarding, I think the act allows that practice to continue, for example. It does, I think, draw some good distinctions between what military personnel and what CIA personnel may be authorized to do. But I'm reluctant to go too far into more details because I don't have the act committed to memory, nor do I really know all the.
But what's kind of frightening there is that, as you say, euphemisms and use of language to describe these things, where, if the public hears, well, they're going to, be rendered, like, okay, but I think it's really important to speak to the last part of your talk, that the public be made aware with as neutral of language as possible of exactly what we are condoning to do to other human beings, whatever they want to do to us. And, it's almost like they're trying to keep it secret.
Well, and I think to a large degree, the government, since the beginning of the Iraq War, has used secrecy. Just look at the furor when certain things come out, like being able to look at bank records, being able to monitor phone calls. When those things are revealed, there's an awful lot of sort of oh dear kind of reactions. Secrecy is clearly a weapon of people that want to get away with things that they probably know in their hearts aren't really right. But your point, I couldn't agree with you more. We need to talk in plain language about what goes on. And sometimes that's not easy to figure out. I know a whole bunch of hands went up, but the gentleman in the back was the next one. Yes,
I guess
sir.
two kind of related things. One, what about our support for other states that practice torture? And it's related to the rendition or rendering.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of our credibility in the world has known for a long time we've trained foreign countries to torture people and encourage them to. Isn't that what the School of the Americas was about? Isn't that what, under the Clinton administration, Defense Department, Secretary Collins said, he admitted that it was being done, and he said the manuals were totally out of place. So if you're from Chile or Argentina or any Latin American country, this is not a shock about Abu Ghraib, that we've lost the moral high ground in those places a long time ago.
I guess your point is this is not new, and you're probably right, but that doesn't mean it's okay. Yeah.
Are you aware of any legal precedent for terms such as rendition and unlawful enemy combatant? Is there any history in our legal system for those statuses?
Not that I'm aware of. I'm not going to say categorically there's no precedent, because there may be. It looks like Nina may have a better answer than I do on that.
I just happen to know of a case which does not come out of the United States but of Mexico. In 1836, the rebels in the Alamo, who of course were called rebels according to the Mexican government, since they were, according to the Mexican government, not covered by international law because they were rebels. Then their bodies were not treated with respect and they were burnt. And they were not given quarter, we will slay everybody, which did happen. They were not given quarter because they were considered pirates. And it was the pirate category that was applied from the Mexican point of view. And as far as I'm concerned, the parallel is right there. But I don't think that the United States recognized that category. I don't know if we operated with a category of pirates, but I know that Mexico did.
Yeah, it clearly, what the Mexicans do would not be legal precedent here.
Right, right, but,
Yeah.
And from my own readings, no, I'm not aware of any past incident where we've been able to take that same one, or have taken that same. Yes, sir.
Yeah, just as a point of, hopefully, of clarification of this lady's question, your exchange with her. I've read much of the Military Commissions Act of 1996, and I'm not an attorney, I'm a political scientist, but I think with regard to what you were discussing, the act constrains the government from engaging in the most, quote, serious forms of severe forms of interrogation, but permits the most, quote, permits serious. So it was, in other words, instead of severe forms of interrogation, serious forms of interrogation are allowed. That came out of the compromise with the 3 senators, possibly a semantic difference. And furthermore, in order to give that some kind of clarification, the executive is required to produce a list of acceptable techniques which would be given to military and intelligence officers. However, that list is at the discretion of the executive and is not subject to judicial or review or congressional oversight. It's secret. So what that really seems to mean to me is that the president can simply decide what it is that he wants to allow, and then because it is not subject to review by either of the other 2 branches of government, the legislative branch and the judicial branch, I'm not sure that that the compromise amounted to anything at all. Really.
That's good. You've had your hand up for quite some time.
My question was, you were talking about how all military officers are taught Geneva Convention information. Why only at that level? Why not all military personnel are not?
I shouldn't have given the impression that only officers receive this kind of training. Every soldier, sailor, airman, marine receives some. But it can be, I hate to admit it, but I've seen it, it can be kind of pro forma. Okay, we got the annual lecture on Geneva Conventions. It's going to be an hour in this auditorium. 1,000 Marines are going to sit there and pay attention. Down go the lights, up go the PowerPoint slides. How effective is that training? It varies. It varies greatly, I think. We do train every soldier through a number of, starting with recruit training boot camp. But it certainly is not at the level and at the depth that what we give officers. So that's why I stress the officer training. But I shouldn't have given the impression that, you know, the average private never hears the word Geneva Convention. That's not the case. Yes, sir.
To respond to his point, I am a lawyer, and I seriously doubt that the Congress, in agreement with the executive, can pass a law that says there can be no judicial review of this law.
Calls into question separation of powers.
Yes, I mean, they can say it. I don't think it has any effect. But I guess we'll see.
Well, this thing
I'm
has
not
to
a
go to
lawyer
the courts.
either,
The
but
courts
if he gets
have,
one more justice,
There's a
really?
there. Yeah, I agree.
a lot, you know,
the
along
Supreme
with
Court may
Scalia,
overturn the law.
Alito, and
Well,
they'll uphold it.
yeah, exactly,
I'm worried about that myself.
exactly.
You wanted to make a comment?
Then I just wanted to support this gentleman because it's all they do is in the Supreme Court is need one more, that's Kennedy, and it depends, Kennedy would be the swing vote that they would need because they have 4 that are, I mean, Roberts would have to recuse himself because he's already voted in favor of such an idea, giving the president such enormous power that not even the courts have a right to intervene, let alone legislation, the legislative branch. And so therefore, you know, it will really depend. I know already there is a case already in the district courts relevant to the law, to this 2006 Military Commissions Act.
Yeah, we have not heard the last of this
Oh, no.
debate by any means at all.
No, so we got to really keep our fingers crossed that Kennedy is, well, that he doesn't go with the 4 is so extremely conservatives on the court.
Yes, sir.
In a different direction, if you had to just estimate, approximate, what percentage of officers, either retired or active, would agree with your interpretation and which might not? Just if you
I
had to
hate to
guess.
put a percentage on it because
Yeah,
this is
really.
such an inexact sort of thing. But I would say I truly believe a majority. And one group, in fact, and you may have read a bit of this in the press, these senior lawyers for all the military services, the JAGs, the Judge Advocate Generals, all of the JAGs have come out very strongly and sort of to a large degree been told to shut up and sit down, that we are on real dangerous ground for Geneva Convention non-compliance. And I think senior military, for sure, many of them are, dismayed, embarrassed, ashamed by some of the things that have gone on, like Abu Ghraib, some of the things that we're learning about Guantanamo. For young kids that are in the midst of the battle and the bullets are whizzing, they probably don't have a lot of time to think through this the way, a guy outside that arena does. But I think a lot of our military are very concerned. Let me just leave it at that. I couldn't put a percentage on it. Yes, ma'am.
I know that the Military Commission and the Detainee Detention Act really worries a lot of the retired as well as the active duty military, but part of those acts actually eviscerated habeas corpus, allows unlawful detention without recourse to say, hey, I'm not supposed to be here, limits appellate review to the DC Circuit, which is not anything. But some of these acts are now, other lawyers are coming out and saying, this is a slippery slope, not just for the military, but for the civilian population as well. Because at the president's discretion, or the Secretary of Defense, anyone can be called an unlawful combatant, and they don't even have to give a reason for it. So it's not just the military that's angry about this stuff. It should be spreading out throughout the civilian population.
Well, I think it is. I mean, I think the one reason to be somewhat optimistic is that you're seeing a lot more pushback in the last year than we did in the first 2 years of this war. I think there are more and more people saying, hey, this isn't the way we do things. You know, I mean, the most extreme argument is, hey, this is unconstitutional. And there are plenty of lawyers out there making the arguments in a couple of these respects is this all-powerful executive branch is simply not constitutional. So, I mean, I guess I like to think in the long sweep of history, this is going to be a period of aberration for which the country should be ashamed of itself for a long time. It's not the way it's going to be forever, I think. Yes, ma'am.
To go back to, you gave two arguments why we should adhere, you know, just that the way our soldiers are going to be treated, and then the moral high ground argument. And another one that you didn't mention that is also brought up is that these methods that are torture or border on torture are just not effective, and whatever we're supposed to gain out of them is not reliable. So what do you think it is that the administration or those promoting these methods, do they just not listen to that? Do they think it is effective? Do they ignore that argument that it is ineffective? Or why else would they want, let's say they really know in their heart of hearts that it is ineffective. Why would they want to be doing it? Is it just a sick group of people that are doing a coup, and are we in a fascist state? I mean, how else can you understand what's happening? I mean, do they just think, no, they are really effective?
I think it's a very good question. I'm going to give you not probably as good an answer as you gave the question. I think that the rationale is we want no limits on our ability to pursue this war, this enemy. And you're right, I'm sure there are plenty of people that know that somebody who's been incarcerated for a year will say anything to stop, you know, the interrogation. And you can't rely on that as intelligence. I mean, even if, you know, if he's been incarcerated a year, what does he know anyway? I think a lot of people probably know that. The argument may be, hey, if we really do snatch a guy who really knows something important, we don't want any limits on our ability to try to get that information. I don't think, I'll come back to you in a second. I don't think anybody, at least I hope not, you know, thinks that it's just a good thing to go be able to beat up on people because we have them in our power. I think the issue, and some of the president's statements I think have gotten to this, is he doesn't want restraints on the ability, and I think it's more CIA than military, but whichever, no restraints on their ability to try to get information. But you're right, that's an excellent argument that torture, for the most part, is pretty ineffective in terms of providing actionable intelligence. Yes, ma'am.
Do you think it's the administration's desire to continue that image of hawk when they're standing behind such policy and promoting such policy, and wanting to have the executive that powerful, unlimited in power?
Boy, I don't know. You're asking me to speculate about people's motives, and I don't know any of them.
Well, she just asked you to speculate too.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I have to think that our government is largely populated by people that really do want to do the right thing. Not everybody, but to a large extent, people want to do what they believe is best for the country. I'll give a quick side story. I had the opportunity this week to be part of a symposium. The keynote speaker and participant in several discussions was former Undersecretary of State Richard Armitage. You know, worked for Colin Powell for the first Bush administration. Clearly a guy fairly near the top of the administration. And he talked a lot about the regrets that he has of things he either didn't understand thoroughly enough or did understand but maybe didn't fight hard enough to change. Here's a guy who you would say, okay, you're part of this, you know, hawk cabal or whatever. What were your motivations? And I truly believe, from spending a couple of days listening to him talk, he really wanted to do the right thing and lost the internal bureaucratic fights. I think there are probably lots of Dick Armitages in the government at high levels. I'm willing to concede that even people who violently disagree with about government policy are doing what they think is right. I happen to think they're wrong. but is it just to project a strong image of being a hawk? Is it to, use national security as a political ploy because the midterm elections are coming up? And, you can make all kinds of arguments, and there's probably some truth, and I don't know how much truth. But it's a good thing to think about. Yes, sir.
I think that perhaps the decision by the Supreme Court over 200 years ago to arrogate to itself the power to determine when the other two branches were out of line as something that has always smarted in the presidents over the years. And I think that George Bush, and here I'm playing psychoanalyst for a moment, I think that he would like to leave this presidency as the one president who took back the power from the court and says, Article 2 powers give me the ability to do what I want and nobody can countermand me. And if he can get away with that, he will have countermanded Marbury versus Madison, the great decision of judicial review, and he will have made himself, as I've told my students, probably one of the 2 or 3 most powerful presidents we've ever had. And if he fails in that, and if he fails in Iraq, as Sean Wilentz said in his article in Rolling Stone, he said, George Bush will be one of the 2 or 3 worst presidents we've ever had. So he is rolling the dice, and he's either going to be the greatest and one of the 3 best, or he's going to be one of the 3 worst, and it's all or nothing.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting analysis. And I mean, I think you're right. I think the administration's policies have attempted to say, because we're in a state of war, I have all these exceptional powers. My own feeling is, I think I know how those dice are going to turn out. I think history is going to see him as terrible for the country, terrible for the presidency, and terrible for our system of government. But you got to wait for time to tell. Yeah.
Very often we're talking about, and we hear the expression of that we're a 50-50 nation. We've seen it in the elections, and we're probably going to, maybe not as much in this election, but we still have this sense of there are blue states, there are red states, there are blue counties, there are red counties. And that may be unfair because there's a whole bunch of people who, given more than 2 choices, they will choose a 3rd option. But what I'm curious about, your recommendations, do you see them as bipartisan? Do you see them as something that both Republicans and Democrats could side with?
Well, because it's a Republican administration, I think if you're a Republican, you have a much harder time coming out and being critical, coming back to the compromise that the 3 senators made. I think that may be integral to that compromise, that at some point somebody convinced Senator McCain, Warner, and Graham, hey, you are undermining your own party by doing this. So I think it's harder to be critical of the administration, whichever Democrat. We could, if we moved this whole thing back to the early 90s when it was a Democratic president and a Democratic Congress, and the Republicans were pushing their contract with America, you could switch party hats. So it's not really bipartisan. Not to try to be subtle about how I say it, I think the party in power has screwed it up, and we need to now change. So, yeah, it's, I guess, more of a partisan line than bipartisan. But I would like to think that conservatives and members of the Republican Party are capable of seeing the damage that has been done and saying, gee, we should do something about this.
Because we're actually seeing, especially during the first years of the Patriot Act, we were seeing some very interesting bedfellows coming from the left and the right about the search and seizure, undermining and so forth.
Nothing unconservative about a traditional interpretation of the Constitution.
No, that's pretty conservative, yeah. Yes, sir.
Isn't this question of why advocate torture or unusual methods if they don't work, isn't it part of a larger pattern of disregard for military and diplomatic opinion expressed through Rumsfeld? What's the guy who's now with he was
Paul
Wolfowitz, and sort of this neocon agenda where they sort of have a formed opinion on what they think our world strategy should be, and even if informed opinion, whether it's from the military or State Department or academia, is saying, look, it's not working, they seem to be bent to stay the course, stay the course.
Yeah.
Yeah, no
Well,
matter
it's a-
what, no matter how, it doesn't seem to be
I
working.
think that's a good point. If you read some of the books that are out right now about the whole Iraq War, Cobra 2 by Nick Traynor and John Gordon, Fiasco by Thomas Ricks, State of Denial, the new one by Bob Woodward, I think that sense comes out that at least certain people, and Secretary Rumsfeld seems to be one of the guys at the top of that list, just don't listen or don't hear things that are contrary to their own very strongly held views. You know, in fact, I think Woodward calling his book State of Denial kind of maybe says it all, that there are people in the administration and the government that, in spite of overwhelming evidence, are in a state of denial. They just can't see it.
Well, in terms of convincing people that what you say is a more informed and legal and pragmatic strategy, wouldn't we also want to inform people that, in fact, maybe it's because of our present administration's policies that maybe we are not winning or winning as efficiently this so-called war on terror, that it's not in our security interests. It's part of a general pattern. It's not just disregard for Geneva Conventions, but it's part of a larger pattern of disregard of what informed opinion says is in our nation's best security interests.
And somebody reminded me just the other day that actually part of Thomas Jefferson's beautiful wording in the Declaration is the phrase, with the decent respect for the opinions of mankind. And maybe that's something that everybody ought to go back and look at one more time and say, do we in fact display that decent respect for the opinions of mankind? Because your point is we haven't. Now, you could also say there have been other times in our history where we've been equally blind to the opinions of mankind.
If I was, I'm not saying what I am politically, Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative, whatever, but let's hypothetically say I was a very conservative, wanted aggressive foreign policy, 100 or 1,000-year empire. I want these guys fired because I don't see them accomplishing that. I don't see opposition to them being a Democrat or Republican battle. These guys are failures. They're not even good at doing what they're attempting to do.
You started off talking about ethics and how ethics are transitional, that they change, and the military standards, military law kind of goes along with it to some degree. At periods of time, these laws or standards are established. And my general question is there a track record for changes in military law or in legal systems during periods of war which indicate that those changes are viewed as being legitimate, or if they have endurance over the long haul, or is there a history of that laws that are established during times of war tend to fail ultimately?
It's a really perceptive question. I don't really know. I'm not a good enough historian to give you an absolutely categorical yes or no. My general sense is that the sort of big laws that stay in international law, that apply to war, have mostly been developed after horrific wars, like after World War I, after World War II, lots of changes after Vietnam. Things that are developed during wars often tend to be kind of ad hoc responses to specific situations that don't have long-term relevance. That's more gut feeling. Don't take that to the bank, because I'm not sure enough of our history in war to say that categorically. Yes.
Back to the denial issue, do you think that it's true, legitimate denial on the part of the administration, or is it more maybe a lack, even if, in the face of all this information, a lack of willingness to admit any kind of mistake or error, wrongdoing, because that would show weakness as opposed to just true denial?
Amateur psychologist opinion, I think there's some of both. I think there's more true, what psychologists describe as a state of denial than the second part of your assessment. But I think that part is there. It's hard for all of us to admit, like, boy, we really screwed up big time. And we need to go back and reverse policy. Now, think if you're the president, how hard it is to do that. So I think there's some of that. But primarily, I honestly believe there are people in a state of denial that just don't see the rest of the world the way I've tried to describe it, and many other people see it. But again, I'm not a professional shrink, so take that for just what it's worth. Yes, ma'am.
As this has never been a declared war by Congress, it is quite amazing what the administration and the executive department, the executive branch, get away with by titling it that we're in war, because terrorists are not a nation, they're not a state. So there has been no declaration of war. So how is it for the military? Of course, the military signs up to do what the president wants. So they cannot express any opinion as long as they're in the military, unless they retire, and then they come out and they can express what they think.
To some degree, I only agree in part with that part of what you just said, but please.
Well, I'm supposing, I'm not saying, I'm
okay.
supposing. Is that true?
To some extent. You can't put on your uniform and go out and give a speech in
Well, you
public
make an oath, don't you?
that criticizes the administration. That said, there are lots of opportunities for active duty serving military people to be able to express their opinion. And in fact, something that not well known, every senior officer that's appointed by the president, so that's like for essentially 3-star admirals and generals up, have to go to the Senate to be confirmed in that rank. Well, everybody gets confirmed, but for real senior ones, it's actually, you really have to answer questions. One of the questions for every chairman of the Joint Chiefs, every service chief, every 4-star combatant command commander, I think it's almost the pro forma first question is, do you promise to give us your honest military opinion, even if it's counter to the current administration policy line? And they all, of course, have to say, yes, I do. So, there's one example where for senior people, if a Senate or House committee calls them up and says, well, give us your opinion about what's going on in Iraq, they're bound by their own testimony to give their honest opinion. So I think there are ways that active duty military can say what they truly believe, but there are some limits too. Like I said, I'll get you in a second. There was this case recently of a chaplain who was disciplined because he appeared at an anti-war demonstration in uniform. So there are some things that we agree we won't do. And I'm not sure, did we derail your question, or was that it?
Well, the thing is that, of course, they're not going to really, was that General, what's his name? The one who's the head of the whole Middle Eastern.
The current one is Abazet.
Abazet, that's his name, exactly. In front of Congress and in front of the committees, he's always right behind supporting the president. But then it is in Woodward's book, Woodward writes that when he speaks to Congressman Murtha, he's telling Congressman Murtha they're just that far apart, meaning they think pretty much alike about what's going on in Iraq. So he's not really, so it's true, the ultimate result would be as you're suggesting, but many of them know that they would probably lose their position in 2 seconds.
Yeah, well, I think when you're senior levels, whether you're military or civilian, you do walk a fairly thin line about how much you disagree in public versus what you do in private.
Exactly.
So, and I haven't forgotten, I won't forget. Just to come back to your early comment about not being a declared war, I think the very early congressional resolution that the words roughly translated say, Congress authorizes the president to use whatever force necessary
Right, they
to
give him
pursue
power
the-
to wage war.
Yeah, to wage war. I think that's the legal framework as opposed to a declaration of war. And I mean, you can go back to the first Gulf War and to Vietnam
Yeah,
and
Vietnam
other
too,
things. We
right.
haven't had a formally declared war
Yeah, you're right.
since World War II. I'm not sure how much you can hang on the fact that Congress did not officially declare war. And if so, who would they declare it against? Al-Qaeda?
Exactly.
Afghanistan and Iraq. So I think that that issue of a formal declaration of war by the Congress has been kind of superseded by recent practice. Yes, sir.
It was just a comment to support what she was saying. In spite of the oath, as a practical matter, to get a sense of how the Bush administration deals with those who oppose it, I believe I read just recently that the JAG lawyer who defended the Hamdan case was just cashiered. It should have been a routine promotion from, I guess, what would be lieutenant colonel, or whatever it is, and instead he was cashiered out of the service.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure cashier. That sounds like, bang, you're dead. He was not selected for promotion. I suspect he's a lieutenant commander, which is Navy equivalent to lieutenant to major. So he's probably got somewhere 15, 16 years of service. Was in zone for promotion to the next rank of commander, the counterpart to lieutenant colonel, which would have assured him that he could stay on active duty for 26 years. Having failed to select for that promotion, he will be required to retire at 20 years. But he's not, cashiered. He is able to serve for 20 years, which qualifies for the military pension. So it's not quite as drastic as, hey, we don't like what you did, so you're fired, pack your bags and you're gone. But there is a lot of question about, why did that guy fail to select for promotion? And the fact that he failed to select on this promotion board may not be the end of the story. He can get looked at again next year as having been once passed over but still eligible. He can, if he chooses to follow an appeals process that says, hey, I was unfairly passed over and it's all about the political pressures connected to that case, and that can get reviewed administratively up to the Secretary of the Navy and can even go into a judicial process, a review, to make sure he was in fact treated fairly. So that case is not over by a long shot, but it does cause a lot of people to wonder.
Wasn't it not the first time that he was passed over yet?
I think it was the first time he was passed over. Why, did you read something that he was already previously
I
passed
thought I
over?
heard yesterday or a couple days ago that it wasn't the first time, it was the second.
I don't know. I hadn't heard that. I'm not disagreeing with you because I don't know the details. I mean, one of the things you always wonder about when somebody fails to promote is, what was it in that record that caused a promotion board to not select that individual? It could be all kinds of things. It could be, what everybody suspects, what the media has kind of hinted at is it's punishment because he did too good a job defending this terrorist. I don't know, but time will continue to trickle out more details on that. Yes, sir.
Career motives aside, or trying to protect your career, what this issue of active military people voicing their political opinions or getting involved politically, what is the ethics behind that? And there's a certain respect we have for the military and their opinions and what's going right or wrong. On the other hand, I'm uncomfortable with people in uniform getting too politically active.
Mm-hmm.
That in many countries, that's led to some very bad things.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the ethic in our system dealing with that?
Well, I think the fundamental principle is nonpartisanship, or even bipartisanship isn't exactly the right word. As military, particularly as military officers, we support the Constitution, we work for the country, we don't work for the Republican president or the Democratic president. As Richard Myers told Secretary Rumsfeld when he took office, and Rumsfeld was kind of expressing some unease, dissatisfaction, that, gee, all these senior admirals and generals are all Clinton appointees, and I wonder about their loyalty. Myers then said very strongly to Rumsfeld, hey, there are no Clinton admirals and generals, there are no Bush admirals and generals. We swear an oath to the Constitution, and our loyalty is to whoever our commander-in-chief is, whether he's Republican or Democrat or Libertarian or whatever else he might be. So there is a long tradition. In fact, the guy that many military officers will kind of look back to, George Marshall, when he was on active duty as a general in the Army, he refused, as a matter of principle, to even vote, which we now encourage all military people, hey, exercise your right to vote at a minimum. Marshall said that was too partisan. As an officer of the Army, I can't care who is president, so I don't vote. And it wasn't that he was, just not interested in it. This was one of his very firmly held principles. It's not that black and white for today's military officers. There is a law, it's called the Hatch Act, that does prescribe what political activities individuals may participate in. Very clearly, you're not allowed to be out in uniform of your service, whether you're officer, enlisted, whatever, at political events. And that sounds pretty clear-cut, pretty common sense, but there have been some cases where it gets kind of fuzzy. Gee, was this a political event? I didn't think it was going to be a political event, but then here comes somebody giving a partisan speech. There I was in uniform. But there is that act, the Hatch Act. There are certainly regulations that each service puts out that tells its officers and its enlisted personnel, hey, these are things you can't do. And I agree with you. I would hate to see the military become a major political force. Like, you could look at Turkey, you could look at Pakistan, you could look at a number of countries where Thailand most recently, the military reserves the right to say, gee, I don't like the way things are going, we'll take over for a while. That's certainly not the way we think of our country. So yeah, it's iffy, but I also don't want people to just say, hey, my country, right or wrong, no matter what. Stephen Decatur guy wrote that 200 years ago. It's not good enough.
Well, that's the thing that odd to me is I generally agree with some of the opinions coming out, but in the back of my mind, I also have a certain apprehension about that.
Yeah, you don't want to see the military become a third political party. Sorry.
I just want to go back to my point about the power of rhetoric, and I think it really is, and basic idea of truth, ethical truth. And it seems to me that everyone in this room has sort of been on, as if there's an issue. I mean, I don't think there are two sides to this issue. I think, to my mind, when I listen to the kind of things you're saying, it's like, obviously, these things are wrong, and if you have an answer why they're not wrong. But rather than get a direct answer, the other side, say the administration or those in support of the administration, defer to spokespeople who are very skilled at the use of rhetoric. And so people who are letting these things go on and don't go vote against it are saying, well, and then they just, give voice to comments like Karl Rove would say, oh, the other side, the Democrats, wants to give the give the terrorists therapy. That's their way of dealing with the situation, which is clearly, a great rhetorical falsehood.
Good soundbite.
Good soundbite, and so then people think and that's how, so I think it's a very dangerous, it seems harmless, like, well, he's just giving his opinion, everybody's entitled to his opinion. But actually, when rhetoric is used in that fashion, it's a way of covering over the truth and making it seem like there's two sides, two legitimate sides, when in fact, one side is just pushing evil or something wrong, and because they don't have a real answer to why, to justify that it isn't wrong. So as a philosophy teacher and a logic teacher, it just hits home to me all the more how imperative it is that American people become aware of, become critical thinkers and can hear rhetoric and fallacious reasoning for what it is. So that's another way, just in daily life, you can try to get people to open their ears to what's really being said.
Mhm. Yeah, there's a good example, sort of closer to home for me. The argument has been advanced for why we need to redefine Common Article 3 in terms more acceptable to administration. The argument is our soldiers are confused, and I can tell you, absolutely, that is a fallacious argument.
How does that supposed to work?
Nobody was confused about the wording of Common Article 3 relative to treatment of prisoners of war. And yet, that line kept coming out over and over. Gee, our soldiers are confused, they need more clarity.
Oh, so we need to rewrite it.
We need to rewrite it to make it more clear and make it easier for soldiers to understand. I would bet a paycheck, go ask any 100 soldiers if they understand what that said, and they all will say, yeah, or at least most of them should.
So it's just much easier
It's
for
just,
people
you know,
to hear it.
Somebody said if you repeat a lie often enough, everybody starts to believe it.
Mhm.
And to a degree, political rhetoric follows that
Exactly.
fundamental principle. If you say
Yeah.
something long enough, at least some people will start to think it's true, whether it is true or not true.
So it's very insidious.
Yeah, it's the use of, get to you in a second, the use of political rhetoric, for want of a better term, I think is very dangerous. Yes, sir.
And you find political rhetoric runs all sides. For example, your comment of comparing the Vietnam torture with Abu Ghraib is way off base. That's not a factual thing. The treatment of our prisoners in Vietnam was much different than what went on Abu Ghraib. And to use those as equals is rhetoric, in my view. As far as non-combatants, history spies have always been in that category. Civil War, the spies were non-combatants who were treated differently than soldiers or civilians. Very similar today. So there is history
Spies
there.
with non-combatants is rhetoric.
No. They were in a special category. My point is they were in a special category. They were not combatants. They were not non-combatants. They were spies, and they were treated differently. So there is historical precedent for that. And again, I'm not making a case for anything that's going on. I'm merely addressing some of the comments that have been made. I think that I believe that the president would love to get rid of Gitmo. I think that it's a real burden on his neck, that if he had it to do all over, he wouldn't start it in the first place. I believe the reason it started is if you start off with what does Al-Qaeda do? Well, they just cut their head off and move on. And so he said, well, we can't cut their head off and move on. We aren't going to just shoot them. We have to do something with them. And so we interned them. Now, bad decision, good decision, I'm not going there. I'm just saying that it's on a continuum, and he got somewhere I think he doesn't want to go. And I think eventually they're going to get out of there. And I don't, but it's, again, the definition of torture and not. Another factual thing, does, quote, torture work? We had a case of a Army captain who was court-martialed because he got information on the spot by sticking a gun to a guy's head and saying, I'm going to shoot you. And then he fired into the wall, and the guy gave him critical information that saved his whole military unit. So torture, that would be torture to some people. You're putting a gun at someone's head and then shooting just to miss them could be considered torture by a lot of people. Yet it did yield a good deal of information. So I think, again, to say that torture, coercion, persuasion, whatever you want to put it, doesn't yield good information is incorrect. There are a number of classified things that have been found out about and things that have been stopped because of treatment of people. Now, I'm not going to say whether it's good treatment or bad people, but the way captured people were treated has yielded information that has saved American lives and has averted disasters. So, you know, there's all these degrees of things. Now, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't look at this. It doesn't mean that the Geneva Convention. I believe that there is an absolute, one thing you have not mentioned, I believe in an absolute morality, an absolute standard, which you didn't mention as one of the justifications for morality and our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence mentions the word God, which I don't know if I can do here or not. But, you know, it's, you know, and you can talk about, well, do we treat them well because they treat us well? You know, that goes back to do unto others. So there is a biblical grounds for that, which is a ground truth of some people. And in the Constitution, it relies on that. Today, we find much less, you know, that we like to find reasonable man justifications for things, and that's okay too, you know. But I just think there's a lot of things that in your talk could have gone a little one way or the other.
I guess I was not trying to give a comprehensive, all-perspective talk on this. I was speaking from a point of view, which is, and that point of view is we've made some mistakes, and we're better off as a country the sooner we correct those mistakes. It doesn't mean I don't love my country. It doesn't mean I'm not patriotic. It doesn't mean I'm in favor of terrorists. I just think we've made some mistakes, and we need to correct them. But I'm really curious on your comment. Maybe we'll talk afterwards rather than take a lot of time. But your comment at the very beginning saying, hey, what happened at Abu Ghraib is in no way comparable to what happened to our POWs in Vietnam. I'd love to hear that argument a little bit more, because on the surface, at least, I disagree with that. But maybe we can talk afterwards.
I think that Abu Ghraib was a terrible, terrible thing. I think it was the fault of leadership. Bad leadership allowed that to happen. And I think that a very few people did that. It was not a national policy. It was not a military policy. It was not a congressional policy. It was not a presidential policy. It was the policy of some individuals that were not being managed by their superiors properly, a failure of leadership. Vietnam prison camp was not a failure of leadership. It was an execution of a national policy of Vietnam.
I see the
That's one. Number two, the severity is, and I don't know how many POWs you know. My roommate from college was there for 6 years, and he and I know him very well, and I know a lot of POWs, and I can tell you the severity in Vietnam was much, much worse than anything that happened at Abu Ghraib, even the things the CIA did. And again, I have information about that. So the comparison, I think that it was an arrow in the back is absolutely true. I think it was a politically disaster, but I don't think it's comparable as to what the nation, you know, we may look very bad by it, and that I agree with, but it is not a comparable on a severity or on a policy basis.
I don't want to take more time. I guess I'd make the point, waterboarding and the ropes used in North Vietnam are not all that different in terms of what it does to the individuals. And yes, I do know quite a few of the POWs from Vietnam. But anyway, I respect what you say. I don't entirely agree with it. Yes, ma'am.
Just very briefly,
And this will
I
have to
think-
be, this will have to be one of the
Let's
last.
Yeah.
run out of time.
I think the reason why Thomas Jefferson wrote to the nation in 1791, relevant to the separation of church and state, was to absolutely not have such a suggestion as you suggested, that with your suggestion that from the Bible, that what others do to us, well, then we have a right to do to them.
That's not what I said.
Well,
No,
you
no,
are,
what others
the
do,
suggestion
you should
is,
do
it
to
is
others.
implied.
No, it's the reverse.
Definitely, if you're going to go
Absolutely the
according
reverse.
to the Bible and what supposedly God said.
You stated
So
the
there's
Constitution referred to
a
God.
separation of church and state in this country since 1791. And thank goodness, it has to be abided by.
I guess Nina says,
Absolutely,
You,
it's only just two. If you want to take a couple more questions, we can do it.
I don't mind, I'm available. I don't have all the
It's
answers
just
to all
one
these
question.
questions.
Well, war is not supposed to be pretty, and it seems to me political policies appear to be disrupting the course of military operations. And to me, missions are not being accomplished accordingly.
I'm not sure I heard the question. I mean, it's a good statement, and certainly there
The political policies that are in effect seem to be disrupting the course of military operations. Thus, these particular missions are not being taken care of accordingly. That is my personal point of view. I mean, it seems to me politics and military are two separate issues, and obviously politics wants to intervene in the military aspect of it.
If he's asking your opinion on this.
Wow. It's a longer answer than you're probably interested in. First of all, I disagree that politics and military are really separate. I mean, our sort of founding father of strategy was a guy named Clausewitz, whose famous quote is, "War is continuation of politics by other means." I think war and military operations are always politically driven, politically controlled, politically interfered with. You can't separate and say, hey, this is the military realm, this is the political realm. The two are simply just interwoven in every way. So I guess fundamentally, I disagree with part of your premise. Your statement that I think you said political policies are interfering with military operations. I guess which political policies do you mean? Are you talking about treatment of detainees? Are you talking about...
That seems to be a concerning issue. I mean, obviously, we shouldn't give these people lollipops and say, hey, get on your merry way. I mean, these people are criminals. They need to be detained, you know? And you said to close it down. So,
Yeah, I truly
send
believe
it back.
we
These
need
people
to...
are going to be repeat offenders.
We need to create a process. Well, that process might entail some truly bad guy proven in a court of law to be a truly bad guy to spend the rest of his life in a prison somewhere. But that decision has to be reached through a judicially recognized process. You can't just snatch a guy off the street because somebody else said, oh, he's the operations officer for this terrorist cell, you ought to take him off the street. And 5 years later, he's sitting there with no right of any kind of appeal or anything else that we recognize as individual legal rights. So, I mean, your statement, I'm not sure if I can agree or disagree because I'm not sure exactly what you mean when you say political policies interfering with military operations.
I'd have to be a little bit more specific.
Yeah, are you talking about the arrow in the back thing, like that I quoted, that because of something like Abu Ghraib, it makes it more difficult for that soldier or Marine on the street? Yeah, clearly. Is that a political policy? I'm not sure. It's a blunder more than a political policy.
And some of these moral issues, towards the enemy, do you see it makes the Americans as weak and vulnerable? Some policies that are enacted, like the Geneva Convention, and some of the 7 policies that you mentioned.
Do they make us weak to abide by those Geneva Conventions? No, I don't think so.
Okay.
It's a tactical disadvantage, but at the same time, it allows us to become and be who we are.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. I mean, it really gets to the question of what kind of nation do we want to be? Do we want to be just like Al-Qaeda? I don't. It might be effective to, just perform summary executions every time we capture somebody you think is an enemy, but that's not who we are. And we've never been that way. Yes, sir.
On that note, and that'll have to be the last.
Yeah, we really did promise to get out of the room.
In response to I'm sorry the gentleman left.
Yes,
In
why?
response to his statement that sometimes torture works and we get fruit from torturing people, it just occurred to me that, well, and I suppose the police could be then, on the same basis, allowed to just beat confessions out of people, and we don't
They
need
used to.
Miranda rights, and we don't need the Fifth Amendment, and it'll certainly save prosecutors time and energy, and the courts will move more smoothly, and
But
well,
it's-
that's not us.
That's
And-
not us.
and
That's the
what I wanna
bottom
say to
line.
The gentleman, that's
But
not
at
the
the
way we
same-
want to do business. And we want.
And enough executions in the controlled population.
We're not.
Okay, I will exert my, this has been one of the most vibrant talks and subsequent discussions that we've had. We all want to thank you for being here and for, knocking the subject around with us. So thank you so much.
Thank you.